War and the State. Part 4. War and the Totalitarian State. Like all their pleasures, wars have to be paid for. Governments have at their disposal three methods for financing a war: taxation, borrowing from the public, and monetary inflation, or the creation of new money. Governments may also resort to coercive requisitioning, that is, confiscating the material resources and conscripting the labour services they deem necessary for the war effort, without compensation or in exchange for below market prices and wage rates. Historically, a combination of these methods has generally been used to effect the transfer of resources from civilian to military uses during a large-scale war. From the viewpoint of technical economic theory, however, the government could always realise the funds necessary to carry out its war aims exclusively from increased taxation and non-inflationary borrowing on capital markets. As Joseph Schumpeter pointed out with regard to Austria immediately after World War I, it is clear that, strictly speaking, we could have squeezed the necessary money out of the private economy just as the goods were squeezed out of it. This could have been done by taxes, which would have looked stifling, but which would in fact have been no more oppressive than the devaluation of money, which was their alternative. On the tax side of things, the ratification of the Income Tax Amendment paved the way for a massive increase in taxation once America entered the war. Taxes for the lowest bracket tripled from 2 to 6%, while for the highest bracket they went from a maximum of 13% to 77%. In 1916, less than 500,000 tax returns had been filed. In 1917, the number was nearly 3.5 million, a figure which doubled by 1920. This was in addition to increases in other federal taxes. Federal tax receipts would never again be less than a sum 5 times greater than pre-war levels. And then, of course, there's inflation, the unholy spirit of the unholy trinity. Through the recently established Federal Reserve System, the government created new money to finance its stunning deficits, which by 1918 reached $1 billion each month, more than the total annual federal budget before the war. The debt, which had been less than $1 billion in 1915, rose to $25 billion in 1919. The number of civilian federal employees more than doubled from 1916 to 1918 to 450,000. After the war, 2/3 of the new jobs were eliminated, leaving a permanent net gain of 141,000 employees, a 30% ratchet effect. Joe Salerno notes that war is enormously costly, and inflation is a means by which governments attempt, more or less successfully, to hide these costs from their citizens. For war not only destroys the lives and limbs of the soldiery, but, by progressively consuming the accumulated capital stock of the belligerent nations, eventually shortens and coarsens the lives and shrivels the limbs of the civilian population. While the enormous destruction of productive wealth that war entails would become immediately evident if governments had no recourse but to raise taxes immediately upon the advent of hostilities, their ability to inflate the money supply at will permits them to conceal such destruction behind a veil of rising prices, profits and wages, stable interest rates, and a booming stock market. The efficiencies, such as they are achieved by massive appropriation of individual resources, by rationing, deprivation and disorder, high costs and waste. The perceived efficiency of the planned wartime economy over the perceived inefficiency of the peacetime economy is an illusion. The wartime planned economy satisfies the desires of very few people, even if it does that, while the peacetime economy satisfies the desires of all, at least to some extent. It is not coincidental that when governments want the people to rally around, they declare war. In these days, not wars on other people so much as wars on abstract objects and modes of behaviour, wars on cancer, on drugs, on obesity, on smoking, on climate change. The experts have spoken. The debate is finished. Now let's move into action. During the course of the war, all the states involved in it more and more took direct control of the economic assets of their citizens, such as railroads, shipping, and armaments. Controls were imposed on currency and finance, on wages and prices, and on labour relations, on foodstuffs. Rationing was introduced, which aimed to limit consumption. All these controls required controllers, and the bureaucrats blossomed like mushrooms. Of all these controls, perhaps the most significant was that exercised over the currency and over finance. The gold standard, with its built-in limitations on the money supply, was inimical to the reckless expenditure required by war, and became one of its casualties. The gold standard never recovered from the impact of the war. It was briefly revived in 1925, but Britain abandoned it forever in 1931. Without gold as a peg, currency stability became more dependent than ever on the macroeconomic skills of state officials and central treasuries, writes Porter. I hope I will not be taken to be overly cynical if I ask what these macroeconomic skills are and how they are manifested. The last lingering elements of a gold standard was finally taken off its life machine in the 1970s, and since then the entire world has been engaged in a gigantic sociological, political, financial experiment, with fiat currencies underpinned by nothing at all, like the grin of the fabled Cheshire Cat. In its formative years, the New Deal derived considerable inspiration from Woodrow Wilson's wartime administration. The National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, one of the legislative milestones of the 100 Days, established the National Recovery Administration, consciously modelled after the War Industries Board of 1918-1920. Bad as the bureaucratic expansion of government had been in World War I, it paled into insignificance beside the World War II expansion. If progression was the innovation of World War I in respect of tax, withholding was the innovation of World War II. Introduced as a temporary measure, needless to say, it became permanent. By making income taxation largely invisible and hence less painful, withholding not only helped finance the war effort but greatly facilitated post-war revenue extraction and the permanent maintenance of a large federal bureaucracy. The growth of the irregulatory state was further enhanced by World War II, so that our mid-20th century world found itself with states regulating, sometimes even owning, coal mines, railroads, airlines, steelworks, electricity and gas utilities. Porter writes, "The contrast between the liberal Britain and France of 1914 and the highly regulated, economically engaged states that emerged after 1945 was striking." World War I was enormously expensive, but World War II was 10 times more expensive than World War I. Many new taxes were levied. Income taxes were raised repeatedly until the individual income tax rates extended from a low of 23% to a high of 94%. The income tax, previously a class tax, became a mass tax as the number of returns grew from 15 million in 1940 to 50 million in 1945. Even though annual federal revenue soared from $7 billion to $50 billion between 1940 and 1945, most war expenses still had to be financed by borrowing. The national debt held by the public went up by $200 billion, or more than fivefold. The Federal Reserve System itself brought some $20 billion of government debt, thereby acting as a de facto printing press for the Treasury. Between 1940 and 1948, the money stock increased by 183%, and the dollar lost nearly half its purchasing power. The nature of the horrors of World War I is reasonably well known. What is hard to conceive is the sheer scale of the human casualties. In its first 2 years, more people died in World War I than died in the French Revolution and the Napoleonic conflicts, the minor wars of the 19th and early 20th centuries, including the Crimean, Franco-Prussian and Boer Wars, the Civil War in the USA, and the war between Russia and Japan combined. World War II was even more devastating, not least in the matter of civilian deaths. Before World War I, Napoleon's conscript army had been the largest force ever assembled in modern times, amounting to just under 2 million men. The combined armies of Britain, France and Germany in World War I came to almost 28 million men. The absolutism of the absolutist monarchs of the late 17th and 18th centuries was an absolutism in spirit which, given the limitations of communication and transport, was incapable of being fully materially realized. Subject to the same limitations, war also was limited. During this period, the size of armies increased enormously. The French army in the early 18th century stood at 150,000 men, reaching a peak of almost 400,000 during the War of the Spanish Succession. By 1708, the Russian army had reached 113,000 men under Peter the Great and exceeded 200,000 by the time his reign came to an end. It was during this time that armies became permanent in the form of regiments. Military ranks were regularized and troops maintained in barracks instead of quartered ad hoc on the civilian population. All of this required centralization and the suppression of private armies. This centralization was produced by military force. The military, in turn, were used to collect the taxes that provided their funding and the funding of the ever-growing bureaucracy of the absolute state. The money required to maintain these military establishments was enormous. The army enforced collection of the tax by brute force, its inevitable abuses spurring the flight of the populace beyond the ever more distant frontier. The bulk of tax went to support those very tax-collecting troops. In Prussia, 80% of tax revenue. In Russia, between 80 and 95%. In lockstep with the development of the expanded armies went a correspondingly expanded bureaucracy to administer the troops and the money. War tends to give the lie to the state's claim to be the protector of life and property. Over 100 million persons died violently in the 20th century, either as victims of war or of staged genocide, a toll that eclipses the total losses of all previous wars or massacres in all ages of human history combined, writes Porter. Porter's figure of 100 million is on the conservative end of the scale. Others put the figure closer to 200 million. But what's a million or two here or there? In the wars of the 20th century, not less than 62 million civilians have perished, nearly 20 million more than the 43 million military personnel killed. By its very nature, totalitarianism has been half in love with easeful death. The antecedents of totalitarianism all shared a common thread, a belief in the achievement of human progress through violence and conflict, writes Porter. Conflict, strife, struggle are thought to be the very stuff of life and death. Totalitarian societies are civil societies organized as if they were armies. The defining attribute of the totalitarian state was perpetual mobilization for war, war against foreign adversaries, both real and imagined, and war against its own population. It can be no surprise to find that those who have been militarized by their service in the war were receptive to the siren song of the totalitarian state. Life in a genuine civil society is hard, not least because you have to look after yourself. To those used to the comradeship of the trenches, the challenge of self-sufficiency came as an unwelcome shock. Little wonder then that the offer of the incipient totalitarian states to replicate the solidarity and comradeship of war in civilian society was well nigh irresistible to many. 50% of all Nazi recruits were veterans of World War I, a figure far higher than the population as a whole. Another factor that made the social environment propitious for the new tribalism was the devastating effect of war on the institutions of civil society. Little remained between the naked individual and the state. The choice seemed to be on your own or with everyone else together. Of course, there were gaps between the totalitarian ambitions of the new tribal states and their ability to implement totalitarianism in fact. Of the various states who took this route, Stalinist Russia was perhaps the most successful in deleting intermediate social institutions, certainly more successful than Nazi Germany, and conspicuously more successful than Fascist Italy. Just as when the human body comes under attack, physiologically scarce resources are directed towards the protection and preservation of vital organs, so too in war, all power and control moves inexorably towards the centre. A war, any war, is essential to keep it there. If an external enemy cannot be found, then an internal enemy must be found or made. Many candidates have played the role of internal enemy: Jews, saboteurs, Trotskyites, kulaks, etc. While a war against internal enemies, real or imagined, was a feature of all totalitarian states, it took a particularly virulent form in the Soviet Union. The Russian Civil War, so called, which lasted from 1918 to 1921, rivaled the extent of World War I. Less striking, but equally as deadly, were the wars of Stalinist forced collectivization, which resulted not only in fighting between the peasants and Soviet troops, but in engineered famines in the Ukraine and Kazakhstan. In this piece of social engineering, about 11 million people died. The purge of 1936 to 1938 reduced the Russian population by another 3 million. Stalin's purges were a unique form of statistical terror, purely prophylactic in nature, intended to atomize society and destroy or deter any conceivable opposition, even before such opposition existed. The guilt or innocence of his victims was besides the point. Millions died for the sole purpose of keeping hundreds of millions in a state of constant fear, writes Porter. If the 17th century absolutist state gave us centralization and the explosion of the military, and the 19th century nation-state gave us the fusion of nationalism and statism, the 20th century gave us a state in which almost all the citizens were supposed to have a say in its direction, while the state intervened in the economy and provided, or attempted to provide, for the welfare of all its citizens. It's not common to link warfare and welfare. One seems to be organised mass social destruction, the other organised mass social construction. Yet they are linked. The historical linkages between war and the welfare state are too close and too extensive to dismiss as mere coincidences of chronology, writes Porter. The beginnings of the welfare state is to be found in Bismarck's Prussia in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War, but it becomes more widely instantiated only during and after World War I, until finally it achieves the status of an unquestioned, perhaps even fundamental part of the role of the state after World War II. It comes as a surprise to most people to learn that the first extensive state provision of social security measures took place not in Britain or the United States or even in France, but in Prussia. In the 1880s, Bismarck provided sickness insurance, accident insurance, and old age insurance. By the turn of the century, the militarized, Prussianized German state had the most comprehensive system of labour protection and social welfare provision of any country in Europe, writes Porter. Where Prussia led, France followed, albeit at a temporal distance of 15 to 20 years, so that by the early 1900s it had in place provision for healthcare assistance, social insurance, and old age pensions. In Britain, welfare spending went from 4% before the First World War to about 8% after it, to around 18% in 1950. The mass state, the regulatory state, the welfare state, in short, the collectivist state that reigns in Europe today is an offspring of the total warfare of the industrial age. Conservatives tend to be accepting of warfare and distrustful of welfare. Modern liberals welcome welfare and deprecate warfare. Both would resist any claim that the two are closely connected, and yet it is so. For most of its history, the modern state, whether quasi-dynastic, national or collectivist, had spent most of its revenue on war and war-related activities. By the middle of the 20th century, welfare spending overtook warfare spending, even in the United States, which also maintained the largest single military establishment in the world. Between 1950 and 1980, welfare spending went from being just over 26% of the federal spending to just over 54%. Summary. What is wrong with human beings? Is it the case that our ordinary lives are so boring that war and violence provide some relief from its deadening grip? Are human beings naturally bellicose? If war is to be distinguished from mere violence, the killing it involves must be justified. Arthur Koestler believes that there is a problem with the serendipitous evolutionary development of the human brain, with the later neocortex sitting on top of the older brain but not being sufficiently integrated with it. The trouble with our species, he writes, is not an excess of aggression, but an excess capacity for fanatical devotion. War has the effect of uniting a group in the way that almost nothing else can. War is not a matter of individual violence writ large. It takes a state of some kind to make a war. But wars also make states. States and wars are reciprocally supporting. All the great empires of the ancient world have their origin in war. The nature of war and the manner of its conduct is intimately connected to the emergence of the various types of state. War tends to promote the cult of the great leader. The human suffering and physical devastation are obvious enough consequences of war, though not so obvious as to prevent its constant recurrence. What is not so often noted is the staggering financial cost of war, resulting not only from the damage and destruction of property, which has to be replaced, but from the finance needed to pay, transport and supply the soldiers who are to partake in this unique form of social interaction. It is not common to link warfare and welfare. One seems to be organized mass social destruction, the other organized mass social construction. Yet they are linked. The historical linkages between war and the welfare state are too close and too extensive to dismiss as mere coincidences of chronology.